The lecture hall at Eastford University was built to intimidate. Everything about it, from the towering oak-paneled walls to the stern portraits of mathematicians glaring down from gilded frames, reminded students of the weight of tradition and the crushing expectations of greatness. Rows of students sat in a semicircle, notebooks open, laptops humming quietly, the low buzz of whispered conversations fading as the heavy wooden doors creaked shut. At the front, under the glare of antique brass lamps, sat 3 professors. They were men who had spent decades shaping reputations as much as they had shaping equations. Professor Aldridge, the oldest, had a sharp, hawk-like nose and a voice that could cut through stone. On his left, Professor Morton drummed his fingers against the desk, a rhythm that usually meant impatience. Beside him, Professor Caldwell leaned back, hands clasped, eyes flicking over the students with the faintest trace of disdain. Together, they carried an unspoken rule: brilliance was demanded, mediocrity was punished, and weakness was exposed without mercy. Marcus Carter, seated in the very front row, knew this atmosphere all too well. He was quiet by nature, but not timid. His presence drew attention for reasons beyond academics. His dark skin, his neatly cropped hair, his sharp but reserved eyes, he stood out in a room where most faces belonged to children of legacy, wealth, or privilege. He had earned his place through scholarship and relentless work, yet whispers followed him wherever he went. The scholarship kid. The outsider. The one who didn't fit the mold. He didn't flinch at whispers anymore, but he heard them, like static under a radio broadcast. Even now, as he opened his notebook with its crisp white pages and uncapped his pen, a pair of voices floated from behind him. "Think he'll keep up today?" one asked with a half-suppressed laugh. "He's only here because they need the numbers," another replied. "Wait until they put him on the spot." Marcus ignored them, focusing instead on the equation Aldridge had scrawled across the board. The professor's chalk moved with ruthless efficiency, symbols and letters forming chains that would make most students dizzy. Marcus' pen kept up, neat handwriting copying each term in silence. His concentration was steady, though his stomach churned with the same low hum of pressure he felt every time Aldridge's eyes swept the room. Today, something was different. The professors weren't simply teaching. Their glances weren't drifting over the whole hall. They were fixed, deliberately, on Marcus. Morton leaned in toward Aldridge, muttering something. Aldridge's mouth tightened into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Caldwell's gaze lingered on Marcus like a hawk circling prey. The lecture carried on, dense with theory and abstraction, but the tension was thick enough for Marcus to feel it pressing against his shoulders. He scribbled notes faster, aware that something was coming, though he didn't yet know what. Finally, Aldridge snapped the chalk against the board with a sharp crack and turned. His gaze locked onto Marcus. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone feigning casual interest. "Why don't you join us at the front?" The air in the hall shifted. Dozens of heads swiveled. Some students perked up, eyes gleaming with curiosity. Others smirked knowingly. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but he rose from his chair with deliberate calm, setting his notebook aside and smoothing the front of his shirt. His footsteps echoed against the marble floor as he crossed the room. Each step felt heavier, carrying the weight of judgment, of expectation, of every whisper that doubted his right to sit in this hall. He reached the board, where Aldridge extended a piece of chalk with the slow precision of a man offering a weapon. "Let's see," Aldridge continued, voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "You've been rather quiet in our lectures. Perhaps you can show us what you've learned." The chalk was pressed into Marcus' hand. It was dry, fragile, leaving faint white dust on his fingers. He glanced at the board, where Aldridge had written an unfinished equation. His mind ticked over it quickly, mapping patterns, seeking entry points, but his thoughts were interrupted by a muffled chuckle from somewhere behind him. Caldwell leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Don't be nervous," he said, his voice smooth, mocking. "We'd all like to see what you can do." Marcus tightened his grip on the chalk, feeling it nearly snap under the pressure. The silence in the room was suffocating now. Rows of students leaned forward, the hunger for spectacle clear in their eyes. He could almost hear their thoughts. This is the moment he stumbles, the moment he proves he doesn't belong. The professors waited, their smiles sharp, their confidence in his failure obvious. Marcus raised the chalk, eyes fixed on the unfinished problem. His hand hovered for a second, suspended in the stillness. The smell of chalk dust and polished wood hung in the air. Behind him, Aldridge's voice cut through like a blade. "Well?" he said. "Don't keep us waiting." The equation loomed, vast and deliberate, a trap designed not to test knowledge but to break dignity. Marcus felt every eye in the hall boring into his back, the collective breath of the room held in anticipation of his failure. And still, he stood there, chalk poised. The smirk on Aldridge's face widened. The scene was set. The silence stretched, unbearable. Then Marcus drew his first line. The chalk in Marcus's hand felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried the weight of every eye in the room. The board was a battlefield waiting to be claimed, and behind him, the professors sat in their thrones, smug anticipation etched across their faces. The problem that glared back at him wasn't just complex. It was deliberately chosen, a monstrous knot of symbols and variables meant to suffocate anyone who dared approach it. The air buzzed with whispers. Students leaned sideways to murmur into each other's ears, laughter bubbling at the edges of the silence. "Look at him," someone muttered. "He's frozen." Another voice chimed in, half amused, half cruel. "What did they expect? That he'd actually solve it?" Marcus heard every word, though he kept his eyes locked on the symbols before him. His jaw tightened, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He wasn't frozen. He was calculating, breathing, waiting for the noise to fade into nothing. Professor Aldridge let out a low chuckle, his voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "This shouldn't take long. Some problems," he said, pausing as though savoring the moment, "are simply too big for some minds." Laughter broke out in little bursts, not just from the back rows but from scattered corners of the hall. A few students smirked openly, their pens stilled on their notebooks, waiting for the spectacle to unfold. It was no longer a lecture, it was theater. Marcus lifted his hand, but just as he began to press the chalk against the board, Professor Caldwell's voice slithered into the silence. "Don't strain yourself, Mr. Carter. If it's beyond you, no shame in admitting it. Some doors," he said with a pointed glance, "were never meant to be opened." The implication was sharp enough to slice. Marcus's grip faltered for a second, the chalk squeaking as it brushed the surface. He felt the laughter ripple again. His shoulders tightened, heat rising in his chest, but he steadied his breathing. He had faced ridicule before. He had endured sharper words, heavier dismissals. Still, this moment burned because it wasn't just about him. It was about every assumption packed into those stares, every expectation of failure wrapped around his identity. A voice from the rows added to the sting. "Bet he won't even make it past the first step." The laughter this time was harsher, louder, a wave of mockery that washed over him. He let it hit and roll past, eyes narrowing on the sprawling equation. The numbers and letters no longer blurred. They sharpened, the lines between them forming patterns, connections. Beneath the noise, beneath the pressure, the problem whispered its logic to him. He began to move his hand again, but Aldridge's voice sliced across the room. "Careful, boy. Once chalk touches the board, there's no taking it back. A mistake here," he gestured to the rows of students watching, "and you'll never live it down." The word boy landed heavy, poisonous, coated in a tone that sent a fresh wave of whispers across the room. Marcus inhaled slowly, pressing the chalk against the surface, letting the sound of its scratch drown out the murmurs behind him. His first line was deliberate, small, not yet diving into the solution but anchoring himself. From behind, Caldwell scoffed. "Perhaps we should spare the poor lad. He looks overwhelmed already." But Aldridge's smirk only grew. "No, let him try. Let's see what he thinks he knows. Sometimes failure teaches more than success." The laughter that followed was no longer just scattered. It swelled, a cruel chorus. Students nudged each other, whispered bets about how quickly he would crumble, some even pulling out their phones under the desks to capture the humiliation they were certain was coming. Marcus's ears burned, but his mind grew sharper with every word they hurled. He could feel the problem unfolding in his thoughts, step by step, a rhythm he knew instinctively. The professors wanted him to trip, but he recognized the trap. The equation was crafted to look unsolvable at first glance, a labyrinth with dead ends scattered throughout. But buried in its structure was a pattern, a hidden key only visible if you looked past the chaos. The chalk moved again, tentative strokes growing bolder. He wrote out a first step, not enough to silence the room, but enough to hush the laughter for a beat. His hand trembled only slightly, his breathing heavier than he wanted. The whispers returned. He's guessing. He doesn't know what he's doing. Typical. Marcus ignored them. He could hear his father's voice in his head, words spoken years ago when he had been doubted before. They'll try to break you with their eyes, son. Don't give them the satisfaction. Focus on the work. The work will speak louder than anything else. He pressed the chalk harder, building on his first step. Each line he wrote sparked more silence than laughter. But Aldridge wasn't done. Interesting approach, the professor said with mock approval. Of course, it won't get you anywhere. But by all means, continue entertaining us. Morton laughed at that, a short bark that echoed through the hall. Caldwell leaned back, a faint grin tugging at his lips. He's determined, Caldwell said softly, but with a sneer hidden in the tone. Determination doesn't equal brilliance. The class chuckled, emboldened again by their words. Marcus's grip tightened until his knuckles whitened. He forced himself not to turn, not to snap back. His silence was his armor. For a moment he stopped writing. He let the chalk hover. He stared at the problem, his pulse in his ears, the noise around him fading. The whispers, the chuckles, the professor's cruel amusement, it all blurred into background static. The equation was all that mattered now. It called to him like a locked door begging for the right key. Behind him, Aldridge sighed, loud and theatrical. Still nothing? Perhaps we should call this exercise finished. The room stirred, some students chuckling, others already jotting notes about his failure. Marcus inhaled, slow and deep, and pressed the chalk again to the board. And this time, his strokes carried weight. He began unraveling the first true step of the solution. The noise dipped. Murmurs faltered. The chalk squeaked across the black surface, symbols unfolding in rapid, confident succession. The trap of the problem revealed itself, and Marcus stepped around it with precision. The professor's smiles didn't fade yet, but a flicker of unease sparked in their eyes. The laughter had stopped. But Marcus wasn't done. He could feel the rhythm building now, each line pulling him deeper into the problem, closer to the heart of it. His hand steadied, his movements smoother, faster. What had begun as trembling now carried certainty. The stage they had built for his humiliation was becoming something else entirely. And though he had not yet reached the end, though the solution still stretched far ahead, the room knew one thing for certain. This was no stumble, no blind guess. This was the beginning of something that would silence them all. The chalk glided now, not hesitantly but with a rhythm that pulled every eye in the hall toward the board. The room, which only minutes ago had been buzzing with laughter and taunts, was now eerily quiet. Each stroke of Marcus's hand dismantled what the professors had built against him. The sprawling monster of an equation was unraveling, not into chaos but into clarity. Step by step, line by line, the impossible began to take shape. Students leaned forward in their seats, pens forgotten, notebooks left half-filled. A few even lifted their phones higher, no longer to record a humiliation but to capture a miracle in motion. The steady scrape of chalk became the only sound, a rhythm that filled the vaulted lecture hall with a strange kind of music. Behind him, Marcus could feel the shift. The heat of mockery had cooled, replaced by something heavier. The professors, once smug in their certainty, sat more rigid now. Caldwell's fingers, once casually steepled, tightened around each other. Morton, whose chuckle had been the loudest, leaned forward as though his eyes might pierce the board and uncover a flaw. Aldridge's smirk had thinned, his gaze hardening into scrutiny. Marcus didn't look back. He didn't need their approval, and he didn't fear their stares. The board was his only opponent now, and even it was beginning to yield. He moved with a precision born not of arrogance but of hours spent alone, long nights in libraries, solving problems no one thought he should even be touching. His knowledge was not gifted, it was earned, scraped together through determination that had outlasted every doubt thrown at him. A gasp rippled through the hall when Marcus skipped over a step most students would have stumbled on. To him, it was instinct, the path clear as day. To them, it was sorcery. The symbols aligned under his hand like stars forming constellations, patterns invisible to others now shining in undeniable light. "Wait," one student whispered. He's actually solving it." Another shook his head, eyes wide. "No way. That's not possible." The whisper spread like fire through the rows, disbelief clashing with awe. For every skeptic who muttered that it was luck, another student's jaw hung open, watching as Marcus carved certainty into the blackboard. Morton broke the silence first, his voice tight. "You're skipping essential steps. That's reckless. If you think this is—" Marcus's chalk struck the board harder, finishing a sequence before Morton could even complete his sentence. He didn't turn, didn't dignify the interruption with a word. The sequence stood there, undeniable, each line feeding seamlessly into the next, flawless in its logic. The silence that followed was deeper than before. Caldwell shifted, his calm veneer cracking. "You think you've found a shortcut," he said, voice measured but strained. "But mathematics doesn't bend for—" Marcus wrote again, his movements fluid, his explanation woven into the rhythm of chalk. He murmured quietly to himself as he worked, not for the professors, not for the audience, but to keep his thoughts steady. The board filled with cascading logic, and at last the heart of the problem lay bare before everyone watching. The students gasped again, louder this time, because now even they could see it. The path forward wasn't just visible, it was undeniable. "Holy, he's doing it! He's actually— No, this is insane!" Phones were held higher, red dots blinking as recordings captured history. Students sat straighter, some clutching their pens again but not to mock, to desperately try to keep up with what they were witnessing. The very equation chosen to humiliate him was becoming a lesson they would carry for the rest of their academic lives. The professor's unease deepened. Aldrich, still clinging to authority, leaned forward, voice sharp. "Even if you reach the end, Mr. Carter, you'll have only mimicked what others could not resolve. Do you think originality is born of rote memorization?" Marcus paused only for a moment, then turned his head slightly, his voice calm but cutting through the silence. "This isn't memorization. This is understanding. Maybe that's why you don't recognize it." The words struck the room like lightning. Gasps rippled across the rows, students staring not just at the brilliance on the board but at the defiance in his tone. Aldrich's mouth tightened, but he had no immediate reply. Marcus turned back to the board and, with a final flourish of chalk, closed the loop. The last symbol landed like a period at the end of a sentence, simple but absolute. The sprawling chaos had collapsed into elegant order. The problem was not only solved, it was solved with a clarity that left no room for debate. For a heartbeat, silence ruled the hall. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Marcus placed the chalk down on the ledge of the board. The sound of it clicking against the wood echoed louder than any applause could have in that moment. He turned, meeting the eyes of the professors directly for the first time since he began. His expression was calm, not triumphant, not arrogant, just steady, unshaken. "Would you like me to explain it slowly?" he asked, his voice even. The room erupted. Students who had been smirking only minutes before now leapt from their seats, cheering, clapping, shouting disbelief and awe. The wave of energy crashed against the professors, who sat stiff, their faces drained of the smug satisfaction they had worn so easily before. Phones caught every angle, the board filled with brilliance, the young man standing before it unshaken, the professors staring as though the ground had shifted beneath them. Some students whistled, others pounded their desks, and the word genius echoed again and again until it was no longer just a whisper but a roar. But amid the thunder of applause and shouts, Marcus stood still, his eyes locked on the professor's. The silence in his gaze was louder than the noise around him. He didn't need to celebrate. The proof was already written behind him. The professors had set a trap, and he had turned it into a stage. The hall, once a theater of mockery, had become his arena of triumph. And as the applause thundered, Marcus remained calm, his words hanging in the air, daring them to respond, daring them to deny what everyone had just seen with their own eyes. The sound of applause still thundered through the lecture hall, but to Marcus it seemed distant, as though he stood inside a glass chamber where only his own heartbeat could reach him. He had not sought their cheers, and yet they came in waves, raw and unrestrained, bouncing off the oak-paneled walls like echoes of a long-withheld truth finally set free. Dozens of phones captured him, immortalizing the moment, broadcasting it to places he could not yet imagine. But in the center of that storm, he remained calm, his gaze fixed on the three men who had summoned him to this stage with the intent to break him. Professor Morton's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes darted from the filled blackboard to Marcus and back again, as if searching for an error that simply wasn't there. His fingers drummed against the desk, but this time not with impatience, with unease. Caldwell leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his composure strained. The faint smile that had played on his face before was gone, replaced with the tight mask of a man forced to swallow a bitter truth. Aldridge, however, sat motionless. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the arms of his chair, his hawk-like nose angled downward, as though by looking long enough he might still bend the facts to his will. The students had seen everything. Their cheers did not stop, their voices rising into chants of his name, their disbelief turning into reverence. What had begun as a spectacle of humiliation had become a coronation of genius, and Marcus stood at the center, the unlikely heir to respect they had denied him before. He lifted his chin, his voice calm but carrying clear through the chaos. Never confuse silence with ignorance. The words cut through the noise like a blade. The cheering faltered, dipping into silence again as the lines sank into every ear. Even the students recording seemed to lower their phones slightly, realizing they were witnessing not just brilliance but a moment of defiance crafted into poetry. Morton finally spoke, his voice cracking despite his effort to sound composed. This doesn't prove anything. It could be chance, some memorized trick, some. Marcus turned to him fully, eyes sharp but not angry, his tone steady. Chance doesn't solve a problem you've dismissed as unsolvable. Tricks don't stand up to logic written line by line. He gestured to the board behind him, where the chalked proof gleamed like white fire against black stone. You wanted failure. You wanted doubt. Instead, you got clarity. That's not chance. That's discipline. That's understanding. A murmur of agreement rippled through the students. Some nodded, others clapped again, softer this time but with conviction. Morton's mouth opened and closed, but no rebuttal came. Caldwell tried next, his voice colder, less shaken but more defensive. Understanding is one thing. Respect is another. Mathematics is not theater, Mr. Carter. It is not a performance for applause. Marcus let the silence hang for a beat before answering. Respect is earned when truth can't be denied. You tried to make me small in front of them, he said, sweeping a hand toward the rows of students. But truth has a way of making itself seen, no matter how hard you try to bury it. The students erupted again, not just in applause but in shouts of agreement. One voice rose above the others. He showed more respect for the math than you ever did. Laughter broke out, scattered but sharp, and for the first time the professors felt the sting of mockery turn back on them. Aldridge stood slowly, his presence commanding as always, though the cracks in his armor were visible. His voice was low, meant to reassert control. You may think this display proves something, but genius without humility is arrogance. Do not mistake applause for validation. Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. Humility is knowing the work speaks louder than words. Arrogance is believing you can decide who belongs and who doesn't. You tried to measure me by your prejudice. I chose to answer with proof. The silence that followed was not empty but heavy, every word hanging like a weight in the air. Students stared at Aldridge, waiting for his retort, but none came. His lips tightened, his eyes flickered, and for the first time, the hawk-like professor looked small in his own hall. The applause returned, stronger, no longer raw shock but deliberate celebration. Students rose to their feet one by one until nearly the entire hall stood. Desks rattled under fists pounding in rhythm, chants of Marcus's name filling the vaulted space. He did not bask in it. He did not lift his arms or bow or smile with arrogance. He simply stepped away from the board, each footfall steady, the roar of the crowd following him. He walked past the professor's desk, their eyes avoiding his, their silence louder than any insult they could have thrown. He returned to his seat, the storm of applause still thundering, but inside himself he felt only calm. Not relief, because he had never truly doubted his mind. Not pride, because this had not been for them. It had been for himself, for the quiet boy who had spent nights hunched over problems no one believed he could solve, for the young man who had walked into halls like these carrying the burden of every assumption made against him. When he sat, a classmate beside him whispered, voice trembling with awe, "You just changed everything." Marcus shook his head gently. "No," he said softly. "The truth was always there. They just didn't want to see it." The professor's chalk trap, meant to break him, had backfired with devastating precision. And now, in front of every witness, the hierarchy of power had shifted. The students no longer saw Marcus as the scholarship outsider. They saw him as the one who had stood under fire and answered with brilliance. The professors had wanted to remind everyone that some doors weren't meant to be opened. But Marcus had not only opened the door, he had stepped through it and left it wide for others to follow. The cheering began to fade as Aldridge, Caldwell, and Morton gathered their papers, their silence an admission they could not disguise. They did not congratulate him. They did not admit fault. They simply retreated, their authority shaken, their power fractured, leaving behind the image of a board filled with answers they themselves had never delivered. The last sound that lingered was not their voices but Marcus's final line, still burning in the minds of every student who had heard it. Never confused silence with ignorance. It would be quoted, repeated, written into notebooks, and whispered in corners long after this day. And though the professors might try to bury it under new lessons, new lectures, new attempts at control, the truth had been seen. The very equation designed to humiliate him had become his crown. The very stage meant to showcase his failure had become the platform of his triumph. And in that hall, filled with the echoes of applause, Marcus Carter was no longer just a student trying to prove he belonged. He had become the proof itself. The applause finally died, the students filing out with buzzing voices, but Marcus remained seated, calm as ever, pen resting in his hand. He knew the battle wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more whispers, more walls to break. But today had taught everyone a lesson none of them would forget.